The Troubles in Northern Ireland. Okay, so before we get to understand the Troubles, we need to talk about a couple people very briefly. England was still a Catholic nation under the rule of Henry VII, and during much of Henry VIII's reign. Essentially, King Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce from his wife, but due to the teachings of Catholicism, the main religion of almost all of Europe during the time, he became excommunicated from the church, and he had the Church of England instead annul his marriage and declared himself the new supreme head, therefore taking away power from the Pope. Even though England's church was still considered a Catholic church, it was now separated from the Pope's rule. And in 1555, Henry ordered down the closing of Roman Catholic abbeys, monasteries, and convents across England, Wales, and Ireland. This act became known as the Dissolution of Monasteries, but that's not necessarily important for the Troubles. Then, afterwards, Henry VIII's son, Edward VII, enforced Protestant reign in England with all services happening in England and Catholic bishops being locked up, with Catholics being treated poorly in general. After Edward VII passed away, Mary I, then his sister, took the throne, and she began to bring Catholicism back, with the Pope back in power and turning services back into Latin. Mary is also known as Bloody Mary, as she burned 300 Protestants who were not accepting of Catholic beliefs on the stake. After her reign ended, Elizabeth I, another descendant of Henry VIII, finally began to try to sort out the religious mess in her reign. She was a raised Protestant, so she changed the religion back to Protestantism again, but with Catholicism methods, such as allowing a Latin print, bishops in church, and she wanted peace in her country, so she punished extremists on both sides, no matter what religion they were. The Church of England was now established as a dominant church, and all the church religions were services were back in English. In Ireland's history, there was a very complex, as they had their own gods prior to Christianity, and then Catholicism was spread with a whole bunch of areas that spoke Gaelic and Native Irish, made it very difficult to teach them Christianity. And then Henry VIII, whenever he began to establish Protestantism, he forced everyone underneath the rule to try to become Protestant. Queen Elizabeth also succeeded in extending English rule over most of the island, with loyalty to Catholic faith becoming a symbol of Irish opposition to English rule. From 1603 onwards, the English government encouraged Protestants from England and Scotland to colonies in the northern Irish province of Ulster. Later on, during the 1649's Catholicism raids in Ireland led by Cromwell, in which 70% of the Irish population, which was Catholic at the time, was reduced to a mere 10%, with 4 years after Cromwell invading, leaving a quarter of the Irish population dead. As Cromwell gained the lands previously in Irish hands, he forced all the Irish Catholics into the southwest areas of Ireland, which is mostly just green rolling hills and barren rocks. The raids were also being told to the soldiers as revenge for what the Irish did in 1641. With an estimate of 4,000 British soldiers actually being killed, the numbers were then exaggerated by the British officials to fuel hatred towards the Catholic Irish population. The Irish, even though they were fellow Christians, the British people also seen the Irish as less than human, with some of the most notable battles during the time being in Wexford and Drogheda. After the conquest died down and came to a rest, the English took the fertile and rich grounds in the north, and the Irish Catholics were forced to move to the southwest side, causing tensions between them to be high. Cromwell and others thought that there was a necessary ethical cleansing of Ireland needed, and sold lots of Irish into slavery if they did not go into the southwest. England continued to carry on Protestant majority through until King Charles I was sentenced to death by committing treason against himself. England then turned into a republic, and Cromwell, leading it, was unsure if the Parliament or Protestantism would survive. Charles II, once he ended up getting back to power after Cromwell essentially was killed, he was believed that he was trying to turn the country back into a Catholic majority. Charles II's brother, James II, or seventh, depending on respectfully where you're from, he was then the next in line to claim the throne. He tried to bring back Catholics into power by putting them in high military standings, political, and academic posts. With the Protestant nobles fearing that Catholic succession was now assured, they appealed to William of Orange, James's son-in-law, who was married to his oldest daughter, Mary. A different Mary, but yes, another noble. William then led an army to Devon, where James II was alienated by his army and navy, which then fled from the battle. In his own doing of fleeing from the battle, he was abducted from power, and William and Mary were crowned as joint monarchs. James II did not wish to just watch the throne get taken away from him, so he then got French support, brought a military back, and landed in Ireland, where William of Orange defeated James II's army at the Battle of Boyne. James II was then defeated, and he lived out the rest of his days in exile and died in France in 1701. When William of Orange passed, Anne, who was the sister of Mary, became queen. And at the end of the days, since she feared for the future, she put the hands into the Duke of Shrewsbury until King George I came into power. There is a simplified version of the topsy-turvy religion which took a toll on the UK. Now that we've covered that, we can talk about the Easter Uprising, which essentially led to the Troubles. So fast forward to 1916, Easter Monday. The Irish nationalists have put together a plan and staged a rebellion against the British government, which is residing in Ireland. The Irish nationalists seized very strategic positions in buildings which made it very difficult for troops to act. Within the week, the fighting was eventually suppressed with more than 2,000 dead or injured as a result. The backing that the Irish nationalists had during the time of the uprising was very low, which grew over the years until the Irish nationalists that planned the operation were almost all now executed or imprisoned, becoming now hailed as martyrs. This forced the British hand, and they started to lock up thousands of people suspecting of helping the uprising to occur, whether they directly helped or indirectly helped, which led to mass imprisonment without trials. In doing so, this helped the Irish nationalists gain even more support. Soon after the Irish Nationalist Party, Sinn Féin, gained a majority of seats in Parliament, they then refused to seat in the UK Parliament, and then sat in 1919 in the chambers in Dublin and declared Irish independence. The now IRA then launched attacks against the British forces occupying Ireland until July of 1921. Comes about and a ceasefire agreement is put in place, with the British giving up 26 counties in the southwest, with the other 6 north counties opting to stay a part of the United Kingdom. This was formally proclaimed on Easter Monday, 1949. Obviously, a lot of important details were skipped over, but that's what happens whenever you need just the bare minimum for a school project. Now we can talk about the Troubles. Since the Republic of Ireland is now mostly independent, they still wanted the other 6 counties, as they were not satisfied with the 26. They wanted all 32 to unite Ireland. They then conducted a low-intensity third-year political deadlock with the 6 northeastern counties. The Catholics were for the United Ireland, and they were conducting under the Provisional IRA, which was nationalists and the minority to a certain extent, the minority in Northern Ireland, but not the minority in Ireland. Against the Catholics were the Protestants, with the regular British military, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and the local recruited Ulster Defence Regiment, which was the majority of Unionists in the north of Ireland. There was then a dark period in which car bombs, communal rioting, house burning, certain places being lethal depending on what side you were on, and shootings with raids becoming very common, leading to very difficult times as youths were either oblivious to what was going around them or picking up arms to fight for something they don't entirely understand. During the period of time from 1922 to 1972, Northern Ireland essentially was a self-governed region of the United Kingdom, with troops from Britain being stationed on the island to end conflicts and discourage conflicts from occurring. With British being present in Ireland, the IRA wished to end Home Rule and went to any means necessary to end it. Catholics kept on complaining of being discriminated for many things, such as votes not mattering as much as the Protestants and employment issues. Although Also, they were complaining about not enough representation of the culture, with no Irish language or history being taught in state schools. The Tri-Flag was essentially illegal. During the Troubles, the violence broke out during a lot of marches, with more notable one being the People's Democracy March from Belfast to Londonderry, or Derry, once again depending if you're Catholic or Protestant. This is known as the Battle of Bogside, which engulfed Catholic neighborhoods in Belfast. The rioting developed into street fighting between Catholics and Protestants, during which an entire Catholic street was burned out. The RUC also fired heavy machine gun rounds at the mainly Catholic Division Tower Flats complex and ended up killing a young boy. The British Army was deployed to restore order and was initially welcomed by the Catholics. The British Army relationship with the nationalist population went downhill as a lot of the efforts became to deal with the task of disarming Republican paramilitaries. Notably, a crackdown on paramilitaries was the Falls Curfew in 1970, in which they cordoned off the Lower Falls area, engaging in several hours of gun battles with the official IRA, killing 4 civilians and clouding the area in tear gas. The London government tried to defuse nationalist militants with a series of reforms in Ireland. The Beast Specials, which were an auxiliary police in theory but in practice were a unionist militia, was then disbanded, and electoral boundaries were withdrawn to reflect Catholic numbers, and housing and employment executives were set up to deal with discrimination. By far the worst year of the Troubles was 1972, where 480 people lost their lives. This year opened up with Bloody Sunday in Derry, in which 14 marchers against internment were shot dead by the British military on January 30th. This massacre gave massive impetus to militant Republicans. The Provisional IRA especially upped their campaign to the greatest intensity, killing over 100 British soldiers in that year, and devastating the centre of Belfast and Derry with car bomb attacks, notably on Bloody Friday, on July 21st, where 9 people were killed and 130 injured by 26 near-simultaneous car bombs. By the summer of 1972, it seemed to show soon that the British might be withdrawing whenever there was direct talks with the IRA leadership. In response, the IRA called a brief ceasefire. Whenever no political agreement was reached, the IRA essentially proposed no other terms than a united Ireland, and then, after a standoff with the British military and loyalists of Belfast, it then flared up into violence and the ceasefire was called off. By the mid-70s, the death toll dropped, but the fight for the land still seemed to show no signs of ending. The IRA began to stop with their more large-scale armed encounters with the British military in 1973, an agreement which was known as the Sundale Agreement, which would be essentially a power-sharing agreement between nationalists and unionists, collapsed after heavy protest by Protestant trade workers and loyalist paramilitaries. The British in the late 1970s decided towards doing 2 things, with the first being to restore primary power back to the Royal Ulster Constabulary Police Force and limit British military presence, which was known as Ulsterization. They also then began to get rid of internment without trial, so that there was no more political prisoners but only prisoners with convicted criminal offenses, which caused the Republican and Loyalist prisoners that were already in jail to demand political prisoner status, which then ended up causing the dirty protest in which they refused to wash or clean out their cells and did not wear their prison uniforms, so they walked around with only a blanket draped over them. This also then led to another notable person, Bobby Sands, leading a hunger strike in 1981, with people starving themselves for death for political status. Through Sands' death, it gave the IRA and nationalists more support, and Sands ended up getting elected into a British Parliament seat, but he refused to stop his strike, so he perished as a result. During the 1980s, it was classified as the Long War, and it was only 3 years where the death toll exceeded 100. Many of the targets of the IRA were particularly of the part-time Ulster Defence Regiment, were also killed while off duty and unarmed. Bombing of civilian targets were still present, particularly in Enniskillen bombing of 1987, in which 12 Protestants attending a war memorial service were killed. The IRA during this time mainly targeted mainland Britain. In 1984, They even tried to assassinate Margaret Thatcher. By the late 1980s, it looked as though the Republicans wished for the end to the war, with talks between Gerry Adams and John Humes, which were both pro-Ireland, talking to the British government, with Gerry Adams underneath the Sinn Féin and John Hume underneath the SD, another left-wing government. They came to an agreement in 1994 with a ceasefire from the IRA, and 6 weeks later, a ceasefire from the main loyalist groups. In 1996, they broke the ceasefire with a massive bomb in mainland England due to Sinn Féin not being allowed into negotiations. When Sinn Féin was allowed back into negotiations, the IRA continued with a ceasefire in the year of 1997. Afterwards, finally, there was peace with the 1998. The Good Friday Agreement was approved by both sides, leading to the status of Northern Ireland in the hand of its own inhabitants through a democratic vote with a grandfather principle put in place so they could obtain either Irish or British citizenship. During this agreement, the RUC was disbanded, then in place of them was formed the Police Service of Northern Ireland, which it needed to reach quotas for both sides being equal members from both political views represented. With the agreement not sitting right with certain individuals of the Provisional IRA, they splintered it to form their own group called the Real IRA and set off a car bomb at Omagh, killing 31 people and injuring many more, with approximately 220 being reported initially injured. The agreement continued with other terrorist attacks from supposed splinter groups trying to affect the peace, but have been unsuccessful in doing so. If it seems to be more one-sided, that's due to me leaving out other less important events due to sheer time, but they are important. If you're interested in Northern Ireland, I would recommend reading up on it or learning more about it, as it is a heavily simplified version that left out tons of information that makes it more meaningful or personal to the reader or viewer, as there is tons of documentaries on this as well. To put very briefly and summarize it, it was essentially who was in the battles. It was Catholic and nationalist paramilitaries against Protestant and loyalist, also paramilitaries with British government military being involved. Where it took place in Northern Ireland, which is to the left of mainland Britain. What for? It was for land ownership. And why was it for land ownership? It was due to religious and historical reasons for the rightful owner of the land. When was it? It was a period of time in the 1960s to the 1980s, and it was conducted through paramilitary and military fighters in a government-involved warfare backed by political and religious people of significance in Northern Ireland.